Chapter 7. The Costs and Benefits of Control. On April 25, 1940, a 14-year-old girl named Elsie Nix was admitted to the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, exhibiting symptoms of a rare and peculiar nature. This was her second visit to the historic clinic. A month earlier, she had been seen by doctors there for persistent and severe headaches. An X-ray had revealed a mass growing in her third ventricle, a fluid-filled space in the middle of the brain. On that prior visit, it was decided not to operate, and the headaches subsided with rest. Elsie's visit on this second occasion was different. Following another attack of severe headaches, she had fallen into an unusual and unresponsive state. When doctors had seen her the previous month, she had been an active young girl, interacting with them in the usual way a child does in a clinic. Now, it was as though a different person was before them. She did not speak or move. She was content to sit silently in one position. Yet, she was not truly catatonic or unconscious. She was aware. Her eyes would follow people and objects around the room. If she was asked to do something repeatedly, she would eventually comply, though slowly and without vigor. She could answer questions, but did so in a whisper, and typically with only the merest 1 or 2 word utterances. Even items and situations that would enliven most children inspired little in her. For example, when she was handed a piece of chocolate, she made a motion to eat it, but it fell out of her hand, and she had no interest in picking it up. If she was tickled, she gave a feeble smile and turned her head away. She was as indifferent to sugar placed in her mouth as to bitter quinine. Even a pinprick was met with only a slight grimace and a slow movement of her hands toward the source of the pain. In sum, Elsie could move and act, but she had seemingly lost the desire to do so. Thankfully, the story of Elsie in the medical literature has a happy ending. When the cyst in Elsie's brain was removed surgically, her symptoms and headaches disappeared. She returned to her previous engaged self, and as of the publication of her case in 1941, the symptoms had not returned. Elsie Nix was the first reported case of a condition called akinetic mutism. Though it can stem from different causes, this condition is often associated with damage to the medial prefrontal cortex, particularly a cortical area called the anterior cingulate cortex. Neurologists recognize akinetic mutism as an unresponsive state, along with an extreme reluctance to perform even simple movements. In other words, this is primarily a deficit of motivation, and it illustrates that getting things done is not just about the mechanisms for choosing actions. It also concerns the desires, incentives, and benefits we attain when we do so. Think about your own moment-to-moment behavior. Perhaps you are reading a book. You set it down to take a sip of tea. You decide the tea needs a bit more heat, so you head to the kitchen to pop it in the microwave for a few moments. While waiting, you check social media on your smartphone. You perform each of these actions because, at some level, you want to do so. You are invigorated to action because of a desired outcome, be it the pleasure of reading or a better-tasting drink. You could have decided that the kitchen is too far away to merit going all the way there to heat up your tea. Or you might be at a particularly compelling point in your book and so don't want to stop reading. Cold tea be damned. The point should be obvious. We don't do things just because of habits or gating mechanisms or stimulus-response associations. We often get things done because we want to do them. Cognitive control is motivated. When viewed through a motivational frame, many control problems we've considered to this point take on a new dimension. Consider multitasking, for example. From a motivational perspective, we can reframe multitasking as a sort of foraging problem. When a berry-eating animal forages, it will spend some time at a bush full of berries before moving to another. How does it decide when it is time to move to a new bush? When the animal arrives, the bush is brimming with plump, juicy berries. But as the animal gobbles up the berries, there are fewer and fewer berries to be harvested. Of course, there are probably other bushes in the area, and if it can find one, these new bushes will be full of juicy berries. So, at some point, the expected value of continuing at the current bush diminishes below the expected value of foraging other bushes, even given the risk that the animal won't find another bush at all. At that point, it leaves to look for another bush. Multitasking can be framed similarly. The task we are currently doing has some value, but that value may diminish over time while other tasks increasingly attract our attention. We work on Sudoku puzzles, but as we solve puzzle after puzzle, our taste for the game starts to diminish. All the while, there are other attractive tasks with some value of their own. Maybe a peek at Instagram beckons. At some point, the value of the current task diminishes to the point that those other tasks are more valuable, and we switch. Cognitive neuroscientist Roshan Cools has been among the pioneers in understanding cognitive control in motivational terms. She has pointed out that framing multitasking as a foraging problem also reframes the stability-flexibility dilemma discussed in Chapter 3. For example, holding a task goal in working memory is a good idea only if it is valuable to continue doing that task. In contrast, shifting to a new task will destabilize the current goal because it has either lost its value or other more valuable goals have supplanted it. Framed in this way, gating working memory is actually a decision about the value of our tasks. It follows, then, that working memory is a system not just for holding information active over the short term, but for retaining information the system finds valuable, or that will, by virtue of its influence on other processing in the brain, lead to future value. Of course, the system cannot simply chase the most immediately appealing task value. For example, there are times when we have been working on a project for a while and other tasks become increasingly attractive, but we nonetheless need to stay focused. Maybe we have to write a particularly touchy email to a coworker. Finding the right words is a challenge, and we'd rather be doing just about anything else. In such circumstances, we can, and often do, shift, finding ourselves a half-hour deep into the latest escapades of the Kardashians instead of doing what we need to get done. However, this kind of value-chasing task switch is a failure of control, not a success. In these moments, our control system is needed to resist the impulse to switch, to keep us on task, or to shift us back to the task we should be doing, should the Kardashians prevail. So the control system must somehow leverage the more subtle and abstract value that leads us to stay on our immediately difficult or boring task so that we can achieve a higher value in the long term. In this chapter, we will consider cognitive control from this motivational perspective. This is important because, like akinetic mutism, many failures of cognitive control can be traced back to a motivational cause rather than one of competency or mental efficiency. Likewise, conceptions of motivation factor into our most fundamental ideas about self-control, mental fatigue, and willpower. Thus, understanding control requires understanding its relationship to motivation. Importantly, however, there are two sides to motivation. First, there is the value we gain by performing a task. This outcome-based value is what most of us associate with motivation. It's the prize at the end. Cognitive control helps us get the prize by allowing us to better shape our behavior to match our situation, making success more likely, even when tasks are complex or novel. However, another side to motivation is often missed. we likely have to do some physical and mental work to get the prize. Engaging in mental work, just like physical work, comes with an aversive experience of mental effort, and that experience is particularly found in tasks requiring cognitive control. Mental effort is a cost that discounts the net value we gain from performing the task. Thus, our motivation to engage in control involves weighing both what we stand to gain and the work required to get there. In other words, there are costs and benefits of control. In the following sections, we will take a look at scientists' efforts to understand both sides of this motivational coin and how the brain's control system computes these trade-offs. We'll start on the benefit side of the ledger and consider what psychology has taught us about how we assign value to our tasks. Value and control. Any theory of decision and choice requires a value function. Value functions describe the relationship between some state of affairs in the world and the degree to which that state is desirable. We can plot the classic hypothetical value function between monetary gains and the value people place on that monetary gain, according to Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Behavioral economists refer to the value axis as subjective value, which acknowledges that the value in question is dependent on the person doing the valuing. For example, a college student might place a higher value on receiving $50 than Bill Gates would. My kids are over the moon when they find a penny on the street, whereas I can't even be bothered to bend down and pick it up. So, subjective value is just that, subjective. The value function is not a straight line. Each monetary gain or loss is not valued equally. Rather, the function is curved such that gains in value are much steeper near the origin. This means a gain of $5 feels considerably more valuable to people than a gain of $1. But getting $1,005 feels about equally as awesome as getting $1,001. Both are a difference of $4, but the latter gain does not feel as valuable as the former. This curve will differ from person to person, but everyone exhibits a similar dampening function. Also, the curve is steeper for losses. In other words, people dislike a $10 loss more than they enjoy a $10 gain. This asymmetry reflects a second well-established phenomenon called loss aversion. Once people have some capital, they do not like to lose it, so they are generally less willing to take risks that incur losses than acquire gains of the same amount. Value functions can conceivably come in many different forms, and the brain must have a means of computing them if we are to make motivated decisions about what task to perform and when. Abstract task goals, like writing an email or taking a walk, are somehow translated into an expression of value that the brain can use to make decisions. We use these value functions to form preferences over seemingly limitless, arbitrary choices about what to do. For example, would you rather bake a pizza or plant some flowers? You probably have never been asked that exact question before, but you also could probably answer it. That we can make side-by-side comparisons about such arbitrarily different tasks also suggests that at some level we can reduce these complex situations to a common currency value function on the fly and without prior experience. Nonetheless, beyond evidence that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is important for these abstract, inferred kinds of value-based decisions, it remains mostly mysterious how the brain computes its value functions and what laws govern this process. This gap in our knowledge is no more evident than in the fact that we can't yet program a general-purpose value function into an artificial intelligence. This is one reason why a true generalist AI is still a long way off. Most successful AIs are programmed with very specific value functions, such as valuing doing the things that win a game of Go. That can work well for learning how to play Go, but the AI can't really use that value function anywhere else. Matt Botvinnik, whom we met earlier in this audiobook, is a leading cognitive neuroscientist and influential cognitive control theorist at Google DeepMind. Matt gives the following example to illustrate why it is hard to give AIs an all-purpose value function. Imagine we built a home robot with the broad goal of serving humans. What value function should we give this robot? Perhaps it should value making humans happy. But how does it do this? How about by making us money? Money makes us happy. So your robot sells your dog. Regardless of how value is computed by the brain, however, once we do decide that an outcome or task is valuable to perform, cognitive control is affected by this valuation. Some of the best evidence for this relationship comes from experiments that incentivize control. These experiments follow a straightforward recipe. You take a cognitive control task and offer a reward for performing quickly and/or with high accuracy. Then you test how performance changes based on the level of incentive proffered. So, for example, during a Stroop task, prior to presenting each word, you might offer either a big reward, say $1, or a small reward, 5 cents, for a fast and accurate response. The critical question is whether Stroop performance will change depending on the amount of incentive on offer. Not surprisingly, performance on a task improves in general when a higher reward is at stake. Importantly, however, the improvement in performance is specifically attributable to the contributions from cognitive control in the task. Consider the case of Stroop. As we saw with CDM, cognitive control specifically confers enhanced focus on the task-relevant feature of the input, the ink color of the word, rather than the word itself, in determining the response. Thus, when incentivized to perform well on the task, people engage control to direct focus more to the ink color than the word, reducing the interference when they mismatch. Of course, this increased focus on the ink color also reduces any benefit that might be gained when the ink color and the word match. This pattern is precisely what is observed in real experiments. Stroop interference is reduced when the ink color and word are incongruent, and people are incentivized, but there is also less benefit when they are congruent. Thus, if people are motivated to rapidly improve their performance on a task, they do so through the cognitive control system. Put another way, using cognitive control has benefits. The modulation of cognitive control by incentives is a widely observed phenomenon, evident across all major laboratory tests of control, from Stroop to stop signal inhibition to task switching. But perhaps you are having trouble getting excited about these observations. We all know that when we really want something, we work harder to get it. Yet these experiments actually provide some very important insights that might not have been obvious otherwise. First, the fact that we can do better on a cognitive control task when properly motivated must also mean that we weren't giving 110% in the first place, to quote my high school PE coach. In other words, cognitive control is not all or none. When someone does a Stroop task, in the absence of any explicit incentive or motivation, they do not give maximal engagement. Whatever is motivating them in the unincentivized case, be it the desire to do well on any task they set their mind to, or to please the experimenter, or whatever the case may be, this motivation was set at some level and led to a corresponding level of control allocation. Manipulating the incentive will modulate control above or below this level of motivation accordingly. Second, control is not merely a reflexive response of the system to the presence of conflict among multiple response pathways or the need to sustain a task goal. It is deployed because addressing that conflict or sustaining that task goal will yield a particularly valuable outcome. The more valuable the outcome is, the more that control will be allocated. In the brain, offering incentives modulates dynamics in the same cortical and basal ganglia systems crucial for working memory gating. One important way that value modulates control in this way is through the effects of the neurotransmitter dopamine, introduced in Chapter 3. Neurons from deep subcortical nuclei in the midbrain, called the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area, are major sources of dopamine to the striatum and the frontal cortex. Neurophysiological studies have found that dopamine cells in the midbrain deliver important informative signals to their cortical and striatal targets that help tie value to behavior. Seminal work by neurophysiologist Wolfram Schultz characterized the responses of the midbrain dopamine cells of the macaque monkey. Schultz conducted a basic Pavlovian learning experiment, wherein a tone always preceded the delivery of a reward, such as a squirt of juice, by a few seconds. Early in the experiment, the juice was met with a volley of activity from the midbrain dopamine cells. This makes sense if one associates firing of these dopamine cells with reward. However, subsequent observations turned this simple view on its head. With experience, the animal learned that whenever that tone sounded, juice was coming a few seconds later. At this point, despite the fact that the thirsty animal still found the juice pleasurable, the dopamine cells no longer increased their firing to the juice squirt. Rather, they now fired to the tone that predicted the juice squirt. Moreover, if the tone sounded but no juice squirt arrived, the dopamine cells actually decreased their firing, suppressing below baseline at about the time the juice squirt was supposed to have arrived. Computational neuroscientists Reed Montague, Peter Dayan, and Terry Sinowski have proposed that this pattern of data mirrors precisely what one would expect if midbrain dopamine cells are computing a critical learning signal called a reward prediction error. This error is a central construct in theories of reinforcement learning from AI. It is computed simply as the difference between an expected and a received reward. Learning in these theories involves continuously and incrementally adjusting expectations of reward based on these errors of prediction. For example, imagine you expect you will receive $5 every time a tone sounds. A tone sounds, and then you receive $2. Uh-oh, you received $3 less than you predicted. And so this is a negative prediction error. $2 minus $5 equals negative $3. Thus, you adjust your expectations regarding tones downward a bit. Now when the tone sounds, you expect only $3. This time, you receive $4. Hey, this is also a prediction error, but it is a positive one of $1. $4 minus $3 equals $1. So you increase your expectations a bit and predict you will receive $3.50 the next time a tone sounds. Over time, this simple kind of learning system will eventually converge to the average expected value associated with the tone. The responses of midbrain dopamine neurons appear to signal these prediction errors. Before the animal learns the relationship between the tone and the juice, the animal has no reason to expect that the tone predicts juice. In fact, it has no reason to expect the juice at all. So when it suddenly receives a juice squirt, this unexpected reward is a positive prediction error that causes firing of the dopamine cells. After the animal learns that the tone does predict the juice, when that juice is delivered as expected, the prediction error is close to zero, and the dopamine cells do not change their firing. However, If the juice fails to arrive as expected, then there is a negative prediction error, and accordingly, a dip in firing. A second interesting feature of these observations is the increase in firing to the tone itself. It is as though the reward-based firing moves backward in time from the juice to the tone over the course of learning. This is also a feature of reinforcement learning. In essence, the animal can learn for any context what reward can be predicted then and at all points in the future. Thus, the presentation of a tone is associated with value because it predicts future juice squirts. Since nothing predicts the tone signals an unexpected increase in expected value, and so a positive prediction error at that point, but at no point after that until after the reward is received. In sum, then, dopamine signals from the midbrain convey information about reward prediction error to its targets in the rest of the system. One of the targets of these dopamine reward prediction errors is the striatum, and this input is one of the ways that corticostriatal gating can be connected to value. We alluded to this role for dopamine in Chapter 3. Dopamine affects the firing of the go and no-go cells within the striatum differently. Go cells will fire more when dopamine levels are increased. No-go cells are inhibited by dopamine and will fire more when dopamine levels dip. Thus, increased dopamine in the striatum will result in a go bias. In other words, less evidence is needed to open the striatal cortical gate and amplify an action or task context under consideration in working memory. By contrast, a dip in dopamine will result in a no-go bias, which will decrease the likelihood of executing an action or activating a gate. This relationship between dopamine and action execution is classically captured in Parkinson's disease. Owing to the degeneration of cells in the substantia nigra, the supply of dopamine to the striatum is greatly reduced in the disease. One consequence of reduced dopamine is an overwhelming no-go bias in these patients. They are often unable to generate sufficient thalamocortical drive to move, resulting in the freezing and rigidity that are the hallmarks of this disorder. Those with severe progression of this disorder can end up trapped in their own bodies, able to think, understand, and contemplate actions without being able to execute them. One long-standing therapy is to replace dopamine by administering a precursor called L-DOPA that the body can synthesize into dopamine. Though this approach has its limits, replacing dopamine can help offset the no-go bias and aid symptom relief. Putting this all together, dopamine modulation of gating is a clear way of connecting value to the gating actions of the basal ganglia. If a context comes along that predicts a value better than expected given the status quo, then there will be a burst of dopamine. This will make the go cells more likely to fire, and accordingly will encourage gating of the action or task representation under consideration. Conversely, a context or goal that comes along and predicts a negative outcome will be met with a dopamine dip. This will make no-go cells more likely to fire, making it less likely that this action or task representation will be gated by the striatum. In this way, value directly modulates the gating actions central to cognitive control. Dopaminergic signals to the striatum serve a second essential purpose as well. They can support learning. Dopamine prediction errors result in long-term changes in the synapses of go and no-go cells, such that they increase and decrease their likelihood of future firing to a set of inputs. When outcomes of an action are better than expected, there is a positive prediction error and an increase in dopamine. Go neurons will strengthen their synapses. Conversely, no-go neurons will increase their synaptic strength when outcomes are worse than expected and dopamine dips. This allows a long-run history of outcomes to be reflected in the decisions of go and no-go cells. These learned actions can include not only motor responses to simple inputs, but also higher-order working memory gating actions at the heart of control function. As we discussed in chapters 3 and 4, many control problems boil down to learning the right working memory gating structure. Reward prediction errors encoded by dopamine can train the striatum to gate the right context at the right time. Each corticostriatal loop in the gating system can learn on its own about what to gate in and out of working memory at its level of the hierarchy based on success with the task. For example, when the system output gates the task demand color naming on color naming trials, it achieves a positive outcome. This strengthens those Go neurons, making it more likely that the system will output color naming again under similar circumstances in the future. In sum, the impact of dopamine reward prediction error signals on the striatum is to increase the Go bias of the working memory gating. And so dopamine in the striatum enhances flexibility in line with expected value. Dopamine signals from the midbrain also project to the prefrontal cortex. But here, they have the opposite effect from that in the striatum. In the cortex, dopamine enhances stability. Increased dopamine in the cortex enhances the ability of prefrontal cortex to maintain information over time and strengthens its neural representations. Reduced dopamine has the opposite effect in the cortex, destabilizing these neural representations and making them more susceptible to interference and distraction. In other words, if we are holding a goal in working memory, but dopamine in the cortex is low, that goal is more likely to be knocked out of memory by another salient task. So in the cortex, dopamine establishes the value of holding something in working memory. If we are engaged in a task that is high value, dopamine will make it more likely that the representation of that task will be stabilized in working memory and will continue to exert a prevailing influence over what we are doing. If the task is low value and dopamine is low, it is easier to lose that task demand from working memory. Thus, dopamine can balance stability versus flexibility between the striatum and cortex. Enhanced dopamine to the cortex enhances stability, allowing us to sustain tasks and goals that are of value to us. Conversely, dopamine's influence on the striatum enhances flexibility and facilitates shifting to a new task or goal that holds higher value than what we are doing now. In this way, dopamine makes value an intrinsic piece of the corticostriatal gating mechanisms of cognitive control. Modulating gating based on value allows us to pursue courses of action that lead to positive outcomes and avoid those that don't. However, as introduced at the outset of the chapter, pursuing high-value benefits is only one side of the story of motivation. There are also costs to engaging in the mental work needed to attain those benefits that need to be taken into account when we decide to engage control and perform a task. How the brain computes these costs and uses them in our control decisions is a long-standing problem and a wide-open area of current research. The mental labor market. We make decisions about what tasks to do based on not only the value we stand to gain, but the costs in mental work required to obtain that value. If I told you that you could earn $5 by adding 3 two-digit numbers in your head, you might take me up on that offer. If there is no cost to mental labor, then $5 offered is $5 gained. However, if I offered you the same $5 to complete every math problem in an elementary school math textbook, you might pass up the money. In effect, you performed a cost-benefit analysis, weighing the benefit of the task of doing mental math against the mental effort required. If you weren't drawn to accept my second offer, then the cost of the mental labor must have exceeded the $5 you stood to gain. One of the clearest places where this trade-off unfolds is the Wild West labor supply dynamics of Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk to insiders. MTurk is a crowdsourcing marketplace run by Amazon where requesters can post small jobs termed Human Intelligence Tasks, or HITS, and a mass of online free agent workers called Turkers can sign up to complete them for a small monetary compensation. The tasks vary widely in their demands, including categorizing different kinds of foods, labeling the content of pictures, doing web searches, or writing a 450-word essay. Usually the tasks are simple, albeit tedious, for humans to do, but they are hard to impossible for a computer. So, a large group of humans, each doing a little bit of the work, can complete a massive task of this kind very quickly. Typically, hits are relatively short to perform, and the compensation is meager. That 450-word essay, for example, might be worth $0.25 to complete. And that's probably on the high side in the grand scope of hits. A simple task like categorizing an image as containing people or not might earn pennies. A recent study of more than 2,500 Turkers performing almost 4 million hits found that the median hourly wage earned by workers on MTurk ranged from $1.77 to $3.18, depending on the method used to compute the wage, and there was a great deal of variance in these estimates. The upshot, however, is that this kind of unregulated mental labor work does not pay well by anyone's standards, but people do the work. The ethics of such an unregulated workplace notwithstanding, the MTurk marketplace provides a natural environment to observe the relationship between mental labor and value. Turkers freely choose what tasks they want to perform. Requesters have to attract Turkers to their jobs. Amazon encourages everyone to consider the expenditure of time relative to the money earned. Notably, however, it does not mention anything about the mental effort involved. Nevertheless, Turkers' decisions to take on a hit do take account of mental work being requested. Computer scientist Panos Epirotis writes a blog about computational and data science issues in the business world. He wrote a series of posts based on an informal study in which he asked Turkers why they do and do not complete hits. The quotes from their responses that he posted on his blog are quite intriguing in light of our current discussion. The following are some examples, with my own emphasis added. The tasks I don't like are tasks that have many complicated steps. In order for me to undertake a task, it has to be either interesting or very easy to do. What attracts me to participate in a particular task is if it is relatively simple, quick, and easy to complete. I only select simple tasks that I can finish while doing something else, for example, watching TV or surfing. Time and money, as Amazon advises, certainly show up as regular considerations in Turkers' responses. But the difficulty of the task, or how much attention it demands, is also common. In broad strokes, Turkers tend to dislike tasks that put heavy demands on cognition generally, and perhaps cognitive control in particular. The influences of mental labor are reflected in the compensation offered for different kinds of tasks. That same large-scale study of earned wages also investigated the relationship between different types of work and the wages they paid. The study found that simple mental tasks, like finding company contact information on a web page or basic audio transcription, yielded a lower wage on average than did more open-ended tasks like logo design or describing the contents of a video. MTurk is a free marketplace, so requesters will generally offer the lowest compensation needed to get Turkers to accept a hit. Thus, These wage differences across categories of work align well with the testimonials from the Turkers themselves. They prefer simpler tasks, and consequently, they are willing to take lower compensation to complete these tasks. Thus, whereas we can be motivated to perform a task because it yields valuable outcomes, that value is discounted by the mental labor involved. Mental work is a cost that reduces the net value of an outcome. If you want someone to do more thinking for you, then you need to compensate them accordingly. C.C. Deans everywhere. Indeed, there has been at least one experimental demonstration by Wouter Kohl and Matt Botvinnik, suggesting that the decision to engage in cognitive work follows the fundamental principles of labor-leisure trade-offs from economics. So, understanding the decision to engage in a task has to account for not only the incentive, but also the cost of mental labor. The fact that mental labor can be aversive and experienced as a cost is a long-standing idea in psychology, and it dates at least to the earliest studies of mental fatigue. For example, in the late 19th century, applied psychologists were asking questions like, how much mental work can students sustain in school? A predominating early view was that aversive feelings of mental fatigue are a direct consequence of a loss of mental efficacy, and further, that our efficacy, once diminished, affects everything, whether mental or physical. Indeed, at least one psychologist, Bettman, in 1892, declared that engaging in exercise, like gymnastics or walking, was not a suitable way for students to relax after doing heavy mental labor. After all, if mental labor drew on the same energy pool as physical labor, how cruel to make students exercise after a long day of thinking. Renowned learning psychologist Edward Thorndike was skeptical of these ideas. In his own experiments, he had found that though people certainly disliked being made to do long mental labor, they could still perform various tasks effectively, even after long bouts of work. For Thorndike, there was a difference between the experience of effort as a motivational matter and the actual efficacy to do mental work. The former was weighed in the decision to work, whereas the latter affected the work itself. Thorndike's doctoral student at Columbia, Tsuruko Arai, conducted a landmark study of mental fatigue that she published in 1912. Arai was the primary subject of her own experiments. She set herself the task of continuously multiplying randomly generated 4-digit numbers with each other in her head, like 2,645 times 5,783. She practiced this task daily for a month until she could memorize the numbers at a glance and perform the mental multiplication with her eyes closed. Once she was satisfied that she would not improve further with practice, Arai began her fatigue test. Over 4 consecutive days, she continuously solved 4-digit multiplication problems from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m., pausing only 2 to 3 seconds between problems in that 12-hour period. For each problem, Arai recorded her answer and the time to complete it. She also recorded her subjective experience during this process. I'm no pushover for mental labor, but even the thought of this much continuous mental work makes me cringe. Arai completed her 4-day marathon successfully, and over the course of her 12-hour days of mental work, her performance did suffer substantially. Arai exhibited a 4-fold slowing in her problem completion rate. She described how difficult it was for her to keep the numbers in her head and avoid intrusive thoughts. Further, the experience of doing math problems for 12 hours a day was associated with an aversive subjective experience of mental fatigue. In her own words, she experienced emotions of repugnance at the thought of certain types of mental activity, amounting sometimes to a sort of mental nausea. Importantly, however, she found only a small relationship between the changes in her performance and her ratings of her subjective experience of mental fatigue over the course of the day. In referencing this work, Thorndike later strongly argued against a depleted mental resource. He claimed that, though fatigued, Arai never reached empty. She could always have done another math problem. Her motivational state was distinct from her mental efficacy. There are some obvious problems with an experiment conducted on a single person, particularly if that person is also the experimenter and a pretty remarkable individual. And by any standard, Tsuruko Arai was a remarkable individual. In 1912, she became the first Japanese woman to earn a PhD in any field. She returned to Japan, where she taught and ran a lab at a university, published an extended version of her graduate thesis as a monograph in Japanese, published a Japanese translation of Francis Galton, penned a memoir called Happy Memories to advocate for women's education based on her experiences in the U.S., and had 2 children along the way. And all this she accomplished in only 3 years. Tragically, Tsuruko Arai Haraguchi passed away from tuberculosis in September 1915 at the age of 29. She was an amazing and inspiring woman, so much so, in fact, that one might reasonably concern that her data are not representative of the rest of us when it comes to mental labor. Nevertheless, Arai's seminal studies on mental fatigue were replicated in later years by other scientists. Notably, a group of 3 graduate students at the University of Southern California in 1946 reproduced Arai's methods right down to the marathon math sessions. It was again a deeply unpleasant experience for all. One student remarked that she would not do this again for $10,000. That's about $130,000 in today's dollars. All 3 students found that, if anything, they did better than Arai had done, even improving their performance by some measures over the course of the fatigue session. They attributed this improvement to being competitive with each other and with the standard for performance that Arai herself set. Thus, there can be little doubt that our performance will decline over time, but in line with Thorndike's supposition, with more motivation, in terms of the expected value of performing well, people can nevertheless improve their performance, even when they are experiencing enhanced mental fatigue. There is always something left in the tank, even after lots of mental work. This disconnect between the subjective experience of effort and ongoing mental efficacy is consequential, because ideas about resources and mental effort, particularly concerning cognitive control, remain influential to this day and have seeped into the broader intellectual consciousness. For example, in an interview with Michael Lewis for Vanity Fair, Barack Obama, who is a pretty good barometer of what an informed, well-read intellectual currently thinks about the world, said, "I'm trying to pare down decisions. I don't want to make decisions about what I'm eating or wearing, because I have too many other decisions to make." Lewis noted that Obama mentioned research that shows the simple act of making decisions degrades one's ability to make further decisions. Perhaps the idea that the mind is a muscle that can be fatigued is intuitive for us, because we can draw an analogy to physical effort. For example, one hypothesis about feelings of fatigue during physical exercise is that they provide a warning signal that we need to stop whatever we are doing, whether lifting a weight or jogging a 5K, because our muscles may soon give out entirely. In this case, fatigue is connected to activity-dependent metabolic changes, whether through the depletion of substrates or buildup of metabolites, that will ultimately prevent the muscle from contracting no matter how much we want to contract it. So it makes sense that a feeling of fatigue provides a sort of stop signal in advance of that catastrophic failure. Yet this seems a poor analogy for the aversive experience of mental effort. It is likely not the case that the feeling of mental fatigue we experience after a long and hard bout of mental work or studying is a warning that we are nearing a mental collapse. Indeed, it is not clear that it is ever possible to bring about a mind stoppage on par with muscle fatigue just by doing lots of mental labor. Assuming your basic bodily needs of food, sleep, and water are taken care of, you could never do so many math problems, for example, that you couldn't possibly do another, even if you wanted to. Rather, a reasonable heuristic would be if the motivation is there, so is the mental capacity. But the motivation is not something to take for granted. Nevertheless, the conception of mental effort as depleting a finite mental resource remains a highly influential model, particularly in popular conceptions of mental work. In fact, it is a reasonable guess that these ideas, whether directly or indirectly, influenced the earlier Obama quote. So given their influence, it is worth evaluating this viewpoint more thoroughly. The primary claim of the resource model is that when we engage in a difficult act of self-control, like resisting eating a cookie, we expend our general mental resources. Because these are general resources, their depletion means that not only will we have a tough time resisting the temptation of another cookie, we will also have a bit more trouble with other tough decisions that have nothing to do with cookies, like deciding what shirt to wear or what show to watch on television. In other words, we have expended a general mental resource, and so its depletion in one setting will transfer to entirely different settings that all depend on that same pool of resources. The primary scientific evidence for this hypothesis started with a seminal series of experiments by Baumeister and colleagues in 1998. These studies utilized a procedure they term ego depletion. First, participants engaged in some activity requiring cognitive control, such as repeatedly foregoing a chocolate in order to eat a radish. After this task, people were asked to perform a second demanding task, also requiring control, like an anagram puzzle. These early studies found that people would give up more quickly or performed with low accuracy on the second task relative to controls. The researchers explained that participants performed more poorly on the second task because they had sapped their willpower doing that first task, leaving them with less of this general resource to use for the second challenging task. Evolutionary psychologist Robert Kurzban highlighted several problems with this perspective. His commentary pointed me to the Obama interview cited earlier. One of his major criticisms effectively echoes those discussed previously. If a resource is being depleted, there is no evidence it ever reaches empty, even after hours of work. On the contrary, as we have noted, incentives and motivation can increase mental effort and induce performance improvements. Indeed, this is even the case when someone has engaged in considerable prior mental work. That this is possible is a major problem for a resources account. If resources are directly tied to the efficacy of one's self-control, how do we muster more merely because we are incentivized? If I have lifted a weight to the point of muscle fatigue, I can't lift any more weight, no matter how much incentive I am offered to do so. The response to this critique from proponents of the resource view has been that people must have control over their resource expenditure. They can budget how much mental resource they deploy based on motivation, and this makes resources available for them to use should better incentives come along. To illustrate, consider the example of Halloween at our house. For reasons that are not fully clear to me, our neighborhood is inordinately popular with kids from all over Providence, Rhode Island. Maybe it is the closer density of homes in the area. But whatever the reason, they show up by the van load. We always think we've bought enough candy, but every year it becomes clear we have underestimated matters yet again. As a result, as the night goes on, we slowly downgrade from a generous handful of candy to each child to 3 pieces, to 2, to 1, in an effort to make our dwindling candy reserves last a bit longer. So perhaps people do the same with their fixed capacity of mental resources. As their capacity gets depleted, they get stingier and stingier about using it, giving out only 1 piece of mental candy per tough decision, rather than a handful. But if they do have incentive to perform a task following depletion, they have resources available to allocate more and improve performance. This is certainly a plausible way to reconcile the data with the theory, but it is still somewhat dissatisfying. First, even pacing ourselves, there should be some point at which all our resources are depleted. We do run out of candy eventually at Halloween. 12 hours a day for 4 days straight spent doing hard mental math without a stoppage, which suggests that Arai either had a pretty big reservoir or was remarkably good at budgeting it. So much so, in fact, that it is unclear why we would be so stingy about deploying our resources over the short timescale of an ego depletion experiment. Certainly, one need not worry about routine momentary decisions like deciding what to eat affecting more important decisions later on. Perhaps an even worse issue with this resources plus motivation account is that this view can predict anything. When people do worse, they have depleted a resource. When they do better, they were motivated. Whatever your experiment, whether you find effort caused depletion or not, you can explain it after the fact with just the right mix of motivation and resource depletion. That's handy if you never want to be wrong. But it is also not a theoretical framework that is testable using the scientific method. So without more constraints, the resources plus motivation account cannot be falsified, and so is not a scientific theory. A further problem for the general resources perspective is empirical, namely, the establishing experimental evidence for ego depletion has recently been called into question. Until recently, the effect of ego depletion appeared to be among the most robust observations in psychology. For example, one meta-analysis conducted in 2010, based on 83 published studies, found depletion effects to be a reliable effect of moderate size. However, follow-up work conducted only a couple years later made it clear that this conclusion may have been premature, and matters are substantially muddier. A careful look at the studies used by the previous meta-analysis suggested that the moderate effects found in that study may have been subject to misleading statistical biases. An updated meta-analysis of ego depletion correcting for these biases found little evidence of an effect. In light of these controversies, 23 laboratories set out to test the phenomenon of ego depletion in a multi-lab replication effort led by psychologists Martin Hagar and Nikos Chatzisarantis, the same scientists who had conducted the original meta-analysis. The labs registered their hypotheses and methods in advance of collecting the data. The task procedures were reviewed by independent scientists, including resource theorists like Baumeister himself, to ensure the methods were reasonably likely to find an effect if it was there. Shockingly, though all but one of the labs had hypothesized that the depletion effect would be observed, only 3 of the 23 labs found an effect that differed from 0. And for one of these, the effect went in the opposite direction. Depletion seemed to improve performance on the next task. Thus, ego depletion failed to replicate using these procedures. It is important to note that this failure to replicate ego depletion used only one experimental setup to test the depletion procedure. Thus, it is conceivable that the problem was with this specific setup and not ego depletion overall. In a published response to the failed replication, Baumeister and colleagues made precisely this argument. And though they had signed off on this procedure before the trial, they qualified that this was only a reserved, go ahead and try sort of pre-approval, rather than a this is sure to work kind. You can come to your own conclusions about how convincing this line of argument is, but it is worth noting that matters have not improved since that 2016 replication failure. A 2018 study of the Many Labs project that tested 2,000 college students on various measures of their cognition looked at the impact of doing a Stroop task on how long a student would last trying to solve an unsolvable anagram problem right afterward. This again seemed like the prototypical depletion case. Indeed, unsolvable anagrams was one of the tests used in the original 1998 study of ego depletion. In the Many Labs study, however, there was no evidence of depletion on anagrams, despite a massive sample size that would enhance the ability to find even a tiny effect. So, though the method is far from settled, there are receding empirical grounds for proposing that we have a general, depletable mental resource that is taxed by self-control. A final issue with the resource's account of mental effort concerns what this resource actually corresponds to in physical terms. What in the brain is being depleted or budgeted by these difficult decisions? Baumeister and colleagues have suggested that glucose might be this resource. Glucose provides energy to every cell in the body, including the neurons in the brain. Thus, the brain has to metabolize glucose continuously and will metabolize more where neurons are more active. Baumeister has proposed that it is glucose metabolism that is tapped by heavy mental work, and so this is the resource the brain is also conserving by signaling mental effort. Again, the basic empirical support for this view has been called into serious question. Another meta-analysis conducted in 2016 found little consistent experimental evidence that glucose is reduced following hard mental work, that glucose levels limit subsequent mental work, or that glucose can be restored to reverse the impact of ego depletion. Thus, as with the ego depletion effects in general, the experimental evidence supporting this hypothesis is not holding up well. The ambiguity of the evidence for the glucose hypothesis notwithstanding, there is further reason to be skeptical about the basic assumptions of this view. As has been pointed out by several critics of this position, merely opening one's eyes results in a large increase in glucose metabolism in the brain, as the brain's perceptual pathways perform many computationally demanding processes on the input. Yet, we do not experience mental effort when we merely open our eyes and process a scene. Thus, increased metabolism of glucose alone cannot be the correlate of the experience of mental effort. It should be noted that there may be other correlates of resources that might work better than glucose. For example, computational cognitive neuroscientist Clay Holroyd has proposed that a substance called amyloid might be at the base of a resource theory of mental effort. Buildups of amyloid in the brain is a well-known correlate of dementias, such as Alzheimer's disease. Holroyd suggests that the presence of amyloid may affect the efficiency of neural processing, analogous to the way that certain metabolites can cause muscle fatigue during physical effort. To avoid this buildup, Holroyd argues that we must regulate our demands on heavy neural processing over the long term, and so the brain places a cost on this kind of processing in the form of mental effort. Views such as this are intriguing, and if verified with data, might ultimately salvage some form of resource model. However, until then, we had best look elsewhere for gaining some understanding of mental effort costs. If mental effort costs do not reflect the depletion of a fixed capacity of mental resources, what does make a task feel effortful? What about a task drives the brain's cost-benefit analysis? This is a crucial point to clarify, because without it, many theories that rely on a concept of mental effort suffer from what logicians call circularity. Circular reasoning is a logical fallacy in which the premise of an argument is used to generate a conclusion that is then used to support the initial premise. For example, if our argument is that we avoid tasks because we find them effortful, how do we know that a task is effortful? If the answer is because we avoided it, we're in trouble. Why did we avoid it? Because it was effortful. Why is it effortful? Because we avoided it, and so on until the sun dies. This obviously can't work as an explanation. To avoid this circularity, we need a way of identifying what about a task makes it effortful, independently from our tendency to discount its outcomes. In other words, we need to identify a definable quality of a task that would constitute effort, and so cause a greater tendency to discount a task outcome. One influential hypothesis along these lines, initially proposed by Kurzban, is that effort costs deter us from performing tasks that tie up our mental apparatus, and so prevent us from doing other tasks. From this point of view, the experience of mental effort has evolved in us to signal the problem of simultaneity, or the limit on our ability to do multiple rewarding things at once. Because of our limited ability to multitask, which we discussed in Chapter 5, when we focus on one task, then we are effectively missing whatever gains we would obtain from other tasks we could be doing. Economists label this an opportunity cost, or the price we pay for taking one option because it prohibits us from taking another one. While we are busy doing a difficult task, like writing that sensitive email or doing our taxes, we are not watching Game of Thrones or catching up with friends on Facebook. So, according to this theory, we experience this opportunity cost as the aversive experience of mental effort while we do our taxes. This hypothesis might lead to the prediction that we should feel mental effort and fatigue by having many things we need to do, regardless of the specific task we are doing. In other words, it feels worse to be doing taxes when we also still need to mow the lawn and do the dishes than when taxes are the only thing left to do. In examples like this, it is hard to separate the opportunity cost of having lots of tasks not completed versus the additional time demanded by completing these tasks later. But this caveat notwithstanding, there is some evidence that having lots of goals stacked in your head is an aversive experience to the degree that they come to mind. As one example, we often experience spontaneous thoughts that are independent of what we are doing. We usually associate these with daydreaming or mind-wandering, or with the moments just before sleep. But they can actually occur any time during our day, busy or not, and are commonly unconnected to what we are presently doing. Scientists can study the content of these spontaneous thoughts by sampling people randomly throughout their day and asking them if they are currently thinking about the task at hand or thinking about something else that spontaneously came to mind. Studies of this kind show that our spontaneous thoughts are mostly about ourselves and tend to have a future bias. In other words, they are more commonly concerned with future events that we might take part in, rather than events of the present or past. Nevertheless, whether of the past, present, or future, spontaneous thoughts are associated with activity in the same ventromedial frontal and medial temporal lobe systems important for episodic future thought. With relevance to mental effort, spontaneous thoughts are also commonly about unfinished tasks and goals. People report that having these thoughts about unmet goals is usually a negative experience. So, in a sense, we carry around a latent to-do list in our head, and items from this list occasionally jump unbidden to mind, akin to a notification on our smartphone. When they do come to mind, these thoughts cause us a bit of anxiety. It is tempting to speculate that these negative, anxious feelings are actually adaptive for us. Doing the tasks on your mental to-do list helps relieve that anxiety, and so that relief is a natural driver to complete the goal stack in our heads. Indeed, one could further speculate that a consistent inability to complete those goals, to stop thinking about them, or to remove them from our goal list, would result in persistent negative emotions. At an extreme, this could contribute to mental health problems. Perhaps consistent with this hypothesis, there is some evidence that the frequency of spontaneous thoughts is associated with a greater risk for mood disorders, like anxiety and depression. Thus, it seems likely that having lots of tasks to do does take a toll emotionally on us and could contribute to aversive experiences of mental effort. However, it is unlikely that maintaining a deep goal stack is the entire answer to the experience of mental effort we feel when we perform a difficult task. For one, spontaneous thoughts, though common, are not constant. Nevertheless, we feel the effort of any difficult task, whether we spontaneously think of other tasks to do or not. Conversely, if costs were computed through a more sustained or active process, doing this constant counterfactual thinking about what we could be doing would be itself quite demanding. And we certainly find tasks to be hard regardless of whether we have other tasks to do or not. So it seems unlikely that feelings of mental effort are simply computed based on the other tasks we could be doing. Importantly, however, the idea of opportunity cost does not require that we literally compute all the hypothetical outcomes we could have had if we had done every other task around us. Rather, we can estimate the opportunity cost based on the task we are doing right now. Assume that at any given moment, there are innumerable tasks of different value we could be doing. Sometimes they are of less value, and sometimes they are of greater value. But over the long run, there is an average value from other mental tasks available to us. This means that in the long run, any task we are doing that ties up our system will tend to lose that value on average. So it is reasonable to estimate the lost value based on the task we're doing, rather than the tasks that we're not. We can tax tasks with bottlenecks in our processing system because these prevent simultaneity. They will lose more value in the long run than tasks without such bottlenecks. That Turker who defined simple tasks as ones that she or he can finish while doing something else might have been on to something. As we discussed in Chapter 5, mechanisms needed for cognitive control are often bottlenecks in tasks because acts of control routinely rely on general, abstract task representations shared across tasks. Thus, a reasonable heuristic is that cognitive control will be taxed as costly if it is needed by a task. If this is so, what is tracking that cost in the brain, and how does it affect the control system? Interestingly, much of the empirical and theoretical ideas in this domain focus on the same part of the brain discussed in the beginning of this chapter in association with the case of Elsie Nix and akinetic mutism, the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate affiliates with the cingulo-opercular network we met in Chapter 3, and that is distinct from the frontoparietal network. Its mechanisms and relationship to cognitive control have been the focus of much research and debate. In the next section, we will take a closer look at these mechanisms for assessing the costs and benefits of control. Anterior cingulate cortex and monitoring. Akinetic mutism is on the extreme end of a spectrum of motivational disorders that stem from damage to the anterior cingulate cortex. These disorders express in terms of unusual responses to situations and circumstances that would typically invigorate healthy people. This association has prima facie led scientists to view the anterior cingulate cortex as an important node in the network for motivated behavior. As a result, its relationship to cognitive control mechanisms has been a topic of considerable focus and debate. The progress of these ideas is important for understanding how the brain might monitor the need for control in tasks, and indeed, its costs. So let's take a closer look. Our story begins with the CDM model that we met in Chapter 3. Recall that CDM was an important innovation because it demonstrated how information held in working memory can provide top-down contextual signals to control behavior. And further, it did so without recourse to a homunculus that set things up just so. Rather, the network used experience with the task to set up the right connections between input, output, hidden, and task-demanded layers. Important as this innovation was, however, CDM had no way of knowing how well it was controlling itself while a trial was happening. Maybe it was providing enough top-down support, or maybe not. It had no way of knowing. Its learned mechanisms relied on the outcome of a trial to adjust its behavior on future trials. This would be akin to receiving a distracting text while driving, but not adjusting your focus on the road until after you noticed yourself checking the text. We don't do this. We resist these unexpected distractions on the fly, adjusting our control to match the task demands that come our way. Online adjustments are a central feature of task control that earlier models had sought to achieve. For example, recall that the TOTE model discussed in Chapter 1 included 2 test steps between the operate and exit stages. These allowed the system to control itself on the fly. So, while CDM went beyond its predecessors by adding learning, it lost the control. Matt Botvinnik and John Cohen put control back into the CDM model by adding a new node responsible for monitoring conflict. In a Stroop task, problems arise when the stimulus maps to 2 different responses at once, and the responses compete with each other. In these circumstances, contextual control is needed to adjudicate the competition. Further, the more competition there is, the more control that is needed to overcome it. In CDM, more control means a stronger, sustained signal from the task demand layer. Thus, the new monitoring node simply received input from each response unit in the response layer of the CDM model and computed a conflict value based on their degree of coactivation. In other words, the conflict value would be higher to the degree that both responses were active together and at roughly the same level. This matches our intuition about competition. Consider 2 tennis players. The most competitive matches are between 2 players of comparable ability, whether they are both pros or both amateurs. Their comparability makes the game competitive. Thus, if both responses are active, there will be more conflict, which will activate the CDM monitoring units more. If one response came to be more active and the other diminished, the conflict value would decline. The conflict monitoring node continuously projected its output to CDM's task demand units. This allowed the current level of conflict readout of the response layer to amplify or diminish the intensity of the task demand output. Thus, the more competition between the responses, the greater the top-down contextual influence to resolve it. Thus, by adding the conflict monitoring node, CDM had a feedback control loop. Botvinnik and Cohen hypothesized that the anterior cingulate cortex specifically served as this conflict monitoring node in the brain, receiving inputs from candidate response pathways and invigorating frontoparietal control systems accordingly to reduce conflict and make a response. This hypothesis became the dominant view of anterior cingulate function for a decade or more, inspiring many studies. And initial returns were good. For instance, across several neuroimaging experiments using different cognitive control manipulations, greater activity was repeatedly observed in the anterior cingulate cortex when response conflict was high, such as in incongruent versus congruent Stroop decisions. This activity pattern was also observed to be distinct from context maintenance activity in the lateral prefrontal cortex, consistent with the separation in CDM between task demand and monitoring layers. As experimental work continued, however, the conflict theory began to strain under new observations. Physiological recordings in animals repeatedly failed to find evidence of cells in the anterior cingulate cortex that were tuned to conflict. Rather, more commonly, these studies found cells tuned to value predictions, outcomes, errors, and the various responses the animal was making. Meanwhile, studies of patients with focal damage to the anterior cingulate cortex failed to exhibit clear deficits in the adjustment of cognitive control based on changes in response conflict. In this context, computational cognitive neuroscientists Josh Brown and William Alexander proposed another model of anterior cingulate function that they termed the predictions of response and outcomes, or PRO. Like CDM, PRO is a neural network model that learns from experience. The anterior cingulate cortex in PRO has access to stimuli input through the senses and action plans that arise given those inputs. And from these, it can predict what responses will be made and what outcomes will follow from those responses. This would be akin to seeing a cake, knowing there is a plan to bite into that cake, and thereby predicting both the chomp your mouth will make and the tasty experience that will follow. In essence, the model learns to predict response-outcome associations. I should clarify that this is subtly different from the associations of value discussed earlier in the chapter, like the juice squirt being predicted by the tone and influencing midbrain dopamine neurons. Those are associations between a stimulus and an outcome. Here, the association of a response and an outcome, biting and tasty cake, is being predicted based on the context and action plan. Importantly, cells in the model's simulated anterior cingulate cortex will fire for these predictions of response and outcome, and then are suppressed if those predictions come to pass. This means that the more options there are for a task, the more predicted responses and outcomes there will be, and so the more activity there will be in the cingulate. This would account for greater activity in incongruent conditions of a Stroop task, for instance, where both the ink color and word predict different responses. Further, if the response or outcome prediction is wrong, this activity will not be suppressed. This is another kind of prediction error signal. However, unlike a dopamine reward prediction error, the prediction errors driving anterior cingulate cells in PRO occur when an expected response or outcome does not occur, regardless of whether the outcome is positive or negative. In other words, they will fire just as much for a pleasant surprise as for a rude awakening. This signal just means that a predicted response and outcome failed to happen. The PRO model has fit a number of previous findings from anterior cingulate that had been explained in terms of response conflict, in addition to a wide range of physiology and neuroimaging data about the anterior cingulate cortex that the basic conflict monitoring hypothesis could not explain. However, while the PRO model demonstrates how outcome prediction and error could explain physiological responses in anterior cingulate cortex, PRO leaves open what the brain does with these prediction signals. One possibility is that the prediction signals can anticipate upcoming errors and lead to rapid error correction. As one example, Mandana Modirusta and Leslie Fellows studied 5 patients with lesions to anterior cingulate cortex performing a conflict task called the Erickson flanker task. In this task, participants are shown arrows in a line and press a left or right button depending on the direction of a central arrow, while ignoring the direction of some flanking arrows. The flankers can face the same direction as the central arrow, or they can face a different direction. In the latter case, healthy people respond more slowly and are more likely to slip and press the wrong direction entirely. These difficulties arise because of response conflict between the left and right responses, which are both cued when the arrow directions are incongruent. In this case, more attention must be paid to the central arrow to overcome this conflict. Often when people make an error on this task, they slow down on the next trial. This is sometimes taken as a post-error adjustment and control, slowing oneself down to prevent further error. The cingulate patients tested by Modirusta and fellows also showed normal post-error slowing despite their lesions. Likewise, they reported being consciously aware of their errors at the same rate as controls. However, the patients differed from healthy controls in one important respect: their speed of error correction. In one experiment, participants were allowed to correct an error by making a second button press quickly after they pressed the wrong key. Healthy people will make these corrections almost immediately, around 200 milliseconds after they make the errant response. This response time is so fast, it is about half that taken to respond normally in the flanker task, around 400 milliseconds. In other words, their correction speeds are so fast, they are likely initiated before the error is actually committed. They are based on a prediction of an upcoming error. This kind of rapid error correction was absent in the cingulate patients. They corrected their errors, but it took them around 700 milliseconds, even slower than the time they took to make the initial response. This means they had to witness themselves commit the error to recognize it and plan a correction. Owing to their brain damage, they were unable to rapidly translate predicted errors into the drive necessary to proactively take actions to correct them. A further clue to the role of anterior cingulate cortex in monitoring our control comes from the experiments on the experience of mental effort and motivation in control. Consider the case of patient RMB, who had a large lesion of the prefrontal cortex, including the anterior cingulate cortex, due to stroke. Despite her large lesion, RMB behaved normally in response to conflict during performance of a Stroop task. However, control participants were also able to consistently report the trials that felt harder to them, those that took them longer to make a response. Though RMB responded more slowly on some trials and faster on others with the same frequency as controls, she was unable to say which trials were subjectively harder and which were easier. Further, the emotional response of controls to difficulty was evident in a measure called galvanic skin response, which is basically the sweatiness of their hands during harder trials. RMB showed no such emotional response. So, reminiscent of Thorndike's distinction between effort and efficacy, RMB performed with the same efficacy as controls, but owing to her damaged anterior cingulate, she did not experience the correlated experience of effort. A fascinating study in 2013 provided some further insight into the subjective experiences associated with anterior cingulate activity. This study was conducted on 2 neurosurgery patients undergoing an operation for epilepsy. As is common in these surgeries, the patients were awake during the procedure. The brain has no pain or touch-sensitive neurons itself, and so patients do not experience any painful or direct sensory experiences of the surgeon operating on their brain. However, as the patient is awake, the surgeon can electrically stimulate the cortex during surgery. This stimulation can induce mental experiences in the patient based on the function of the stimulated cells. In this study, The surgeons directly stimulated anterior cingulate in the absence of response conflict or prediction errors, and documented the resulting effects on the patient's mental experiences. While they received volleys of electrical stimulation to the anterior cingulate cortex, the patient described an onset of feelings of worry or foreboding, along with an enhanced need to overcome some vague future adversity. These feelings ceased when the stimulation was turned off, or when fake, sham stimulation was applied, or when other nearby areas of the brain were stimulated. One patient described these feelings metaphorically, almost like you're headed toward a storm that's on the other side, maybe a couple of miles away, and you've got to get across the hill, and all of a sudden you're sitting there going, how am I going to get over that, through that? That type of a, feeling you have. You're like, Pat's chest. Am I gonna get through this? Stimulation of anterior cingulate gave rise not just to an experience of mental effort, but a feeling that one must persevere to succeed. This would surely be a useful contextual input to the brain's systems for gating and control. In summary, though undoubtedly central to control, the role of the anterior cingulate remains somewhat mysterious. A consistent set of findings suggests that the cingulate is important for making predictions about the responses and outcomes that can be expected given the current context and action plan, and then monitoring whether those predictions are realized. These signals may not be necessary or sufficient for control per se, such as by obligatorily feeding back into prefrontal systems to increase the intensity of control, but they may yield an experience of effort with a task that acts as a context and motivational drive the control system can use. To get a sense of what this means in real-world terms, imagine a multitasking situation of the kind Turkers dislike. For example, perhaps we are working on our taxes while also periodically checking email because we are handling an urgent situation at work. This situation is challenging for our control system to manage, and we will be a little less efficient and more error-prone on both tasks because of the inherent conflict and interference in multitasking. However, it is also the case that multiple responses and outcomes will be predicted by the anterior cingulate as we work our way through various Forms 1040 and Schedules B and D, all the while seeing new email notifications appear. Co-activation of all these possible response pathways and outcomes in anterior cingulate yields a feeling of mental effort. That experience is unpleasant and something we want to avoid unless it's needed. It is the cost of doing these tasks requiring control. It might lead to our focusing more on one of the tasks to push through, or indeed avoiding the multitasking situation altogether. How might these ideas relate to the concepts of value discussed earlier in the chapter? A recent theoretical framework called the expected value of control theory, proposed by my colleague at Brown, Amitai Shenhav, along with John Cohen and Matt Botvinnik, addresses this relationship in an intriguing way. This theory proposes that anterior cingulate has access not only to the costs of cognitive control, but also the benefits. In other words, it can weigh the expected gains from deploying control against the mental effort required to enact it. This cost-benefit analysis would, in turn, modulate the engagement of control by lateral prefrontal systems to be efficient in achieving our goals with the right level of mental effort. We would regulate our level of attention to our tax forms versus our email to the degree that the payoff, that is, finishing our taxes, or resolving that work situation, or both, was sufficiently valuable. This theory is still in the process of being developed to make specific predictions about brain function, including how this cost-benefit analysis is expressed in the anterior cingulate cortex neuronal computations. Nevertheless, it is a promising approach and direction for understanding not just another anterior cingulate cortex function, but the influence on control by factors related to motivation, effort, and value. What motivates us to do a task? Obviously, we mostly pursue tasks we think will lead to valuable outcomes for us. For example, we make coffee because we desire that morning fix. We set a meeting at work because it leads to a goal on a project, and it fulfills a role we are paid to perform. We fill out a tax form to avoid the consequences of not doing so. Control systems that help us focus and perform tasks are driven by these expectations of a valuable outcome. Thus, when our control fails, it might not simply be a limit on our working memory or a sticking working memory gate. It could also be that we aren't sufficiently motivated to apply control in that situation. Importantly, however, as we've discussed in this chapter, we don't expend our mental effort for just any old goal. Our brain does a cost-benefit analysis. We weigh the benefits of success at a task, when aided by cognitive control, against the mental costs of its deployment. The balance on that ledger is what translates into our drive and motivation. Thus, when we find ourselves pulling out a calculator to compute the tip at a restaurant, rather than just doing it in our head, it is not a matter of valuing the outcome more or less. It is that we have found a way to reduce demands on our control system while achieving the same outcome that makes the calculator task have a higher net value than the in-the-head version. In other words, cognitive control is motivated both when we use it and often when we don't. Chapter 8. The Information Retrieval Problem. Most of us have a love-hate relationship with our memories. We rely on our memory to hoard troves of knowledge and squirrel away our fondest moments. These remembrances lend a sense of continuity and structure to our experience. Further, there can be no doubt that memory is essential to human intelligence and to effective cognitive control. By this, I refer not just to our working memory, but also to our long-term memory that stores our experiences and general knowledge, even when they have left our consciousness. Indeed, as discussed in Chapter 2, our memories give us the power to mentally travel through time itself or to visit hypothetical realities. However, few people would describe themselves as having a great memory. We are keenly aware of those times when our memories let us down, coming up blank on someone's name just as we are supposed to introduce them at a party, or struggling in vain to place that song we just know that we know. At these times, the knowledge we seek seems to taunt us, locked away in our memory stores, just out of reach, stubborn and unyielding to our mental exertions. Our memories seem an even sadder affair when compared with our external memory storage devices, like smartphones and laptops. Imagine trying to access a contact phone number on your iPhone, and Siri replies sheepishly, I know that number, but I just can't remember it right now. Here's a random tune I thought of instead. Indeed, these devices are so superior that most of us outsource our brute force memorization to them. Whereas I once carried around a large directory of phone numbers in my head, I no longer know any of my friends' numbers. My phone's storage is simply faster, easier, and more reliable. Does my brain have an advantage over my smartphone, beyond the fact that I can't accidentally leave my head stuck between the couch cushions? Why would the process of evolution have left us with such an unreliable memory? Surely we aren't forgetful because of the useful forgetfulness of our ancestors. So what explains our apparently flawed memory system? The answer to these questions starts with recognizing that our memory didn't really evolve as a storage device like a computer hard drive. As discussed in Chapter 2, we use memory to build models of our world, to predict future outcomes, or to imagine scenarios that might arise. Our memory did not evolve to provide us a record of the past. Rather, it serves our ability to make future decisions. As such, the brain's memory system is specialized to flexibly inform what we are doing. That is, our memory is adapted to solve what information scientists and database experts call the information retrieval problem. The information retrieval problem concerns how a system recovers stored information with a value that exceeds the cost of retrieval itself. This problem is not unique to human memory. It confronts any system with a large database that must be queried for information, whether that database is our brain's lifetime store of accumulated knowledge, the vastness of the Internet, or the collections of a university library. The common problem confronted by all these systems is how to efficiently gain access to high-value information. And the problem gets harder the larger the database. To illustrate, let's consider an example. Periodically, one of my childhood friends visits Providence, Rhode Island, where I live. On these occasions, I like to take him out to a restaurant in town. It's an open secret that Providence punches far above its weight in fine dining, and so sampling the local cuisine is a must for visitors to the city. However, I wouldn't want to take him to the same restaurant we went to the last time he visited. In my planning, I need to remember where we ate previously. Thus, my memories of my last visit with my friend temporarily acquire value with respect to this particular task. For example, a memory of what we talked about at dinner or what he was wearing would be of less value to my task than a memory of what we ate, or indeed, where we ate it. In this example, the relative value of information recovered from memory is clear. It is any memory that answers my problem of where to eat. But there are also costs to consider when searching for high-value memories, which might not be as obvious. For example, one way to recover my target memory might be to retrieve every memory I have of my friend, and then rank each according to its value for my task. Once everything is ranked, I simply act on the most valuable memory. The problem is that we have been friends since we were in middle school together. We played in a band together. We have been close to this day. That is a lifetime of cherished memories. The vast majority of them, however, have very little value for my current task. Even if I could recover every memory of my friend, I would be wasting a lot of time trying to rank them all to find the best one. That would be analogous to checking out every single book in the library to find one specifically concerning the impact of U.S. statutory law on free speech over the Internet. Whatever value might be gained by retrieving the target information would be far outweighed by the costs in search time and checking each item. If I took this approach to remembering the last restaurant we visited, my friend would likely come and go from Providence while I was still sitting in my armchair, sorting through all my memories and ranking their usefulness. Thus, any retrieval attempt yields both benefits and costs. Costs can be incurred by the time spent searching my memory or from retrieval failures, such as recovering the wrong information. In the context of the information retrieval problem, the risk of these failures is that they subvert our goals and result in negative outcomes. For example, imagine that I incorrectly remember bringing my friend to one of my two favorite restaurants. Paradoxically, this might make it more likely that I take him back to the same place I took him before than if I hadn't remembered anything at all. Further, beyond the cost of time and error, difficult acts of retrieval are also felt as an aversive experience of cognitive effort, much like other kinds of intense cognition discussed in Chapter 7. That experience is itself a cost, so minimizing costs is as much a part of the retrieval equation as maximizing the benefits. John Anderson is the Richard King Mellon Professor of Psychology and Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. He has made numerous contributions to our understanding of higher cognition, from mathematical problem-solving to memory. In a series of seminal papers, Anderson emphasized that human memory may be adapted to address the information retrieval problem. According to Anderson's analysis, there are at least two basic components to consider when judging the likelihood of successful retrieval in a system optimized to solving information retrieval. First, The system should be sensitive to how frequently a stored item has been useful in the past. The more a memory has been useful before, the safer the bet that it will be useful again. Imagine you are a librarian deciding which books to keep in the stacks and which to send to the archives off-site. One clue would be how often a book is checked out. Books that were frequently checked out were likely useful, and also will tend to be checked out again in the future. So, keeping these books available in the stacks is a good strategy. Use predicts future use. Our memories can use the same trick. Items we have already retrieved are given some priority for retrieval in the future, and the more that we remember them, the greater the likelihood we will retrieve them again. For this reason, one of the best ways to commit something firmly to memory is to practice retrieving it. With every successful retrieval, it is better lodged in memory and more available to be retrieved in the future. The second factor Anderson highlighted is the context of retrieval. In other words, the setting, the task, and whatever mental and bodily states we experience when we retrieve an item. If a memory has been retrieved in a particular context previously, such as while in a particular place, or while performing a particular task, or while feeling a particular way, or all these things together, then your memory system assumes this memory will be useful in that context again. For example, if you have an anecdote that got you some laughs at parties lately, you are likely to remember that story in other social occasions and might tell it again, to the chagrin of your partner attending these events with you. However, this story is less likely to leap to mind in other contexts, such as while giving a presentation at work or buying groceries. Indeed, some memories are so context-specific that we have a hard time remembering them at all unless we are in the same set of circumstance in which we usually think about them. Our memories are tied to context because human memory retrieval is heavily dependent on the quality of the cues we have available. Cues can be anything: a smell, a sound, a particular object, a thought, or even another memory. Once active in mind, these cues will elicit retrieval of a memory associated with that cue. From an information retrieval perspective, this is your brain's bet about the information that will be useful in this context. The better and more specific your cues, the more readily the associated memory will come to mind. In this way, your context can control memory retrieval and make information remembered in that previous context available to you again. Putting this all together, as we conduct ourselves around our world, busily performing our various errands, our brain's memory system is also busily laying down memories based on where and how frequently we use them. Our retrieval system later guesses which knowledge is useful given our particular history of retrieval and the various cues available to it. As a result, more often than not, the information we need in a given situation appears effortlessly at our fingertips, based on whatever task or goal occupies us. We mostly don't even experience this retrieval as effortful. It occurs automatically. No artificial system comes close to this efficiency. Smartphone attempts to do this kind of automatic information retrieval are ham-handed by comparison. Presently, they mostly give us unsolicited directions and travel times to our next appointment, or guess at the likely finish to a word or phrase with mixed success. Our brain is superior because, unlike a smartphone, our brain has internal, immediate access to our goals, plans, and thoughts while we do a task. It can use some or all this internal information as a context cue for retrieval. Thus, our memory can marry information retrieval directly to the tasks we are doing dynamically as they progress. Of course, we are not entirely dependent on automatic retrieval. We don't have to wander around hoping we bump into the right queue in order to retrieve information we need. Rather, when information we need doesn't immediately leap to mind, we are also able to internally direct our retrieval to the information we need for whatever task prevails. Cognitive control is essential for this kind of remembering. In broad strokes, control aids information retrieval, both by making recovery of useful information more likely and minimizing the costs associated with retrieving it. In this chapter, we will take a close look at cognitive control of memory. As we will see, control over memory retrieval can be roughly divided into two basic categories: those control processes that shape retrieval itself, which we will term controlled retrieval, and those that operate after information has been retrieved, which we will term post-retrieval control. In the next sections, I will define these categories and give some examples of each, and how they contribute to information retrieval. We will then explore what brain systems support these categories of memory control, how the brain assigns values to memories, and what these features might mean for thinking about our own memories. Controlling retrieval. To understand how cognitive control influences retrieval, it is helpful to draw an analogy to an artificial retrieval control process with which we are all familiar, using a web search engine like Google. Google is designed to address the information retrieval problem using established principles from cognitive science. Although its specific algorithm has evolved over the years, the basic principle behind a Google search is its PageRank system. When you enter a search term into Google, PageRank gives an authority score to web pages listing that term based on the number of pages that link to it, weighted by the authority score of the pages doing the linking. In other words, if you were looking for a website on the effect of concussion on the brain, a link from a page that itself has many links, like brainfacts.org, counts more toward a site's PageRank authority than a link from a site with only a few links. So some amateur blog post on concussion read only by the blogger's parents probably won't even make your browser window. The top pages in a Google search, then, will be those linked by lots of other high-authority sites, similarly defined. At its core, then, PageRank follows the heuristic that use is a good indicator of future value. If multiple web pages find a given page to be useful enough to link, then that web page is likely to be useful in the future and should be ranked higher in the search. There are some additional tweaks built into its system, such as giving a bonus to conventional authorities like government or university web pages. But apart from these exceptions, the simple use-based system works quite well. Indeed, the top page of a Google search is often precisely what you are looking for. Even with a sophisticated search engine like Google, however, it is important that you develop a good set of search terms to enter into Google's query field. Imagine, for example, that you want to find my lab website. It's useful that my name is unique. Better, spelled B-A-D-R-E, is a French transliteration of a Lebanese name. It's a rare spelling, even in my own family. Many of my relatives transliterate it as B-A-D-R instead. Of the few E-carrying betters out there, I know of only one other with the first name David, somewhere in France, I think. So it's likely that if you enter just my name into Google, you will get all the information there is out there about me. Now, imagine in contrast that you wanted to look up my colleague Michael Frank at Brown, whom we first met in Chapter 3. His name is basically Google proof, made up of two common first names. And to further complicate matters, there is another Michael Frank at Stanford, who is also a computational cognitive scientist. So, to find out information about the Michael Frank at Brown, you might need to generate a more specialized query, such as entering Michael Frank Brown. Anyone experienced with browsing the web is used to this kind of task, and probably does it without a second thought. In fact, whereas some of you might have entered better in a search for me and found me with only a little browser scrolling, probably no one would enter just Frank for Michael. Thus, you are using some knowledge you already have about Michael, that he works at Brown, to generate your query to get more specific knowledge. This is a retrieval plan that controls retrieval and makes it more likely you'll get to the information you need. Good retrieval plans will lead to good retrieval outcomes. Returning to human memory, we don't have to stop what we are doing and enter a query into our brain's search field to get the information we want. Again, this is one of the advantages that human memory has over an artificial system like Google. Merely perceiving, thinking about, or processing some information essentially submits it as a query to memory automatically, and accordingly our memory obliges us with some associated information. Importantly, however, when the cues available to us in our conduct through the world don't automatically retrieve what we need, we can generate a retrieval plan to control retrieval. And, as with our Google query, we can do so using our existing knowledge to get to more specific and useful knowledge. For example, the information I need about an elephant is very different depending on whether I want to describe one to my child or am considering riding one. If I want to ride an elephant, the information I most strongly associate with an elephant, such as that they are huge and have trunks, is probably less relevant for my task than what I know about their disposition and the places I can find one to ride. So I want to shape the search to make retrieval of these other elephant riding features more likely. I need a retrieval plan that involves a process of retrieving information as a cue for more specific information. One of the clearest examples of how people generate plans for retrieval is during tests of cognitive estimation. These tests ask people to make a good guess at questions they likely have never heard before. For example, what would you estimate the length of the average human male spine to be? Do you have an answer? Assuming you aren't a spine expert who knows this fact already, what approach did you take to answer this question? Everyone has their own approach, but mine would be as follows. I would start with the average human male height, which I know to be around 5 feet 6 inches. Then I know that our spines don't reach all the way from the top of our head down to our ankles, so I subtract around 3 feet for the legs and half a foot or so for the head. And voila, I arrive at a guess of just over 2 feet for the spine. This estimate is close to the actual number, which Google tells me is 2 feet 4 inches, 71 centimeters. Pretty good for a fact I've never explicitly learned. We solve these kinds of problems routinely, all the time. You can see that doing so requires not only recalling facts we already know, like the average human height, but also requires a retrieval plan, a progress of thought that selects the bits of knowledge over which to compute a result. Thus, just as one may need to control a sequence of behaviors, one can also helpfully control a stream of thought from memory. Patients with cognitive control deficits have a hard time with this task. They may be able to recite facts they know, like the average human height, but when presented with a question like the length of the male spine, for which they have no memorized answer, they struggle to generate a reasonable response. Rather, they will tend to give a response based only on what they can immediately retrieve, like responding with the average height of a human male. Retrieval plans do not apply just to estimation. We also use them to retrieve specific facts, details, or experiences we have already stored in memory. For example, imagine I asked you to list all 50 U.S. states. How would you go about this task? If you are from the U.S., this is not asking you to estimate a new fact, as you've known the names of the states since grade school. But coming up with them all is a hard memory task. Just saying whatever states come to mind will get you some of the way, but you will likely run out of steam before getting all 50. Rather, most people come up with some kind of plan to organize and guide their retrieval. For instance, people might try to go through the alphabet, thinking of every state that begins with a particular letter. Or they will work geographically, crisscrossing a mental map of the country as they generate names. Regardless of the specifics, what retrieval plans have in common is that they use your existing knowledge, like the schemas discussed in Chapter 2, to guide retrieval. Like adding Brown to your Michael Frank query, you are using some knowledge as a query for getting to more knowledge. The memory system is playing with what you know, chewing on it, and elaborating it to make retrieval of useful information more likely. One of the most sophisticated and effective organizational strategies for memory is the method of loci, or mind palace. Perhaps contrary to current belief, this technique was not invented by Sherlock Holmes in the eponymous hit BBC series starring Benedict Cumberbatch. The technique is actually quite ancient. It was supposedly introduced by the Roman statesman and orator Cicero, who credited it to the poet Simonides of Chios. The story goes that Simonides was the sole survivor of a dinner party in which all the other guests were burned beyond recognition owing to some terrific calamity. To identify which guests attended, Simonides mentally walked around the table in his memory of the dinner party to remember each person based on where they were seated. According to memory historian Mary Carruthers at New York University, the method of loci was refined to a highly developed skill by medieval scholars. Indeed, mastering it was a fundamental part of academic training in the Middle Ages. For example, a scholar might make only one visit to the Vatican Library during an entire career and have only that chance to read a particular text. So it was crucial to commit that text to memory verbatim. Thus, mastery of mnemonic devices like the method of loci was essential to a successful academic career. In fact, a superior memory was admired as a sign of genius, much like creativity or originality might be considered and cited in a letter of reference today. The method itself, like any skill, takes practice to master. You imagine a place you know very well, like your house. You should know it well enough to be able to see its detailed features and layout in your mind's eye. Then, to memorize any material, you mentally move through the structure and place items to be remembered in different locations throughout the space. For example, you might put each of the 50 states in a different drawer in different rooms throughout your mind palace. Then, when it comes time to retrieve them, you mentally walk through the space, opening those drawers to recover what was placed there. This technique is remarkably powerful. Champion mnemonists who can perform feats like memorizing 145 random words in 5 minutes, a world record set by champion mnemonist Yenja Wintersole in 2018, have trained extensively to use it. What they do is staggering, but it is not magic. Rather, it is leveraging our natural ability to aid memory by structuring learning and remembering with our knowledge. Though most of us don't walk through memory palaces when we remember, the act of controlling memory retrieval can be similarly structured. By accessing the right knowledge schema and using it to guide retrieval, we walk through our knowledge like a medieval academic wanders through a mind palace. In doing so, we foreground certain knowledge and make it available in mind. Once active, this knowledge can then act as a cue to aid retrieval of associated information we need for whatever task we are performing. Generating these knowledge structures and guiding ourselves through them requires cognitive control. Thus, it should come as little surprise that patients with frontal lobe damage have difficulty applying organizational strategies during study or retrieval. Berkeley cognitive neuroscientist Art Shimomura conducted a number of studies characterizing the memory deficits of patients with frontal lobe damage. In one such study, patients and controls were given lists of unrelated words to memorize, and then freely recalled them in any order they liked during a later test. The controls frequently used a number of organizational strategies to help them learn, and then remember the words, like forming a story with the words. Frontal patients used strategies like forming a story far less frequency, only around a third of the time. Instead, the patients were more likely to just close their eyes during retrieval, or to use no strategy at all. What we learn from studying patients like those in Shimomura's study is that applying retrieval plans doesn't occur spontaneously. It is an active process that requires control systems supported by the prefrontal cortex. However, the role of cognitive control may not simply be in executing the organizational strategy itself, such as by forming a story or walking through a mental structure. Rather, control systems may be important for evaluating whether a strategy has added value and whether it is time to shift to something different. This requires a cost-benefit analysis at the heart of the information retrieval problem. In other words, what is the value in deploying the current strategy versus shifting to a new one? In this sense, retrieval can be thought of as another foraging problem. Like our animal from Chapter 7, Searching for Berries, one has to decide when and for how long to probe memory for more information using a particular retrieval plan, and when it is time to try a new one. Consider, for example, the basic free recall test we described earlier. Often, when people are given a list of words to remember, the words come from different categories. There might be animals, tools, and buildings on the list, for instance. At retrieval, those categories can be useful for guiding retrieval. Thus, a common observation is that when people remember the words in any order they choose, they will recall them in groups or clusters based on these categories, regardless of the order they saw them during study. Assuming you are remembering items this way, how long should you remain generating items from one category before switching to a new one? This is akin to the foraging problem in that each category is like a bush for harvesting remembered words rather than berries. You need to decide when word berries are sufficiently depleted in one category that you should switch to a new, more fruitful category. Evidence from patients suggests that frontal cortex is needed for this kind of decision. Though their clustering scores are lower than those of controls, patients with damage to prefrontal cortex will show some degree of clustering during free recall. Importantly, however, the patients will tend to stay with one category longer than controls do, likely past the point where doing so is useful. As a consequence, the patients generate fewer items and make more errors, like coming up with a word that wasn't on the study list or saying the same word twice. But their reduced recall is not necessarily because of amnesia per se. It is at least partly because they were unable to balance the diminishing returns for a given category against the rising costs of retrieval in order to shift appropriately. It is clear, then, that people are able to assess how effectively retrieval is going, and then can shift to new retrieval strategies accordingly, using different knowledge to probe memory in new ways. It is also the case that people use this knowledge to decide whether it is worth exerting mental effort to try to retrieve specific information from memory at all. To illustrate, imagine that you read the original Grimm Brothers version of Little Red Riding Hood. If I later ask you whether Red brought her grandmother a can of energy drink in her basket of treats in that story, you can do one of two things. You might try to remember the line in the story you read describing the specific contents of her basket. If you correctly remember that in this version she brings her grandmother a piece of cake and a bottle of wine, then you can say no to my question based on this direct retrieval. But if you can't easily remember that specific line, then you might just make a plausibility judgment. You can easily remember that Red brought her grandmother treats. You know that an energy drink is not a likely treat for the setting of the story. So, because it is implausible, you answer no, even though you don't directly remember what was specifically in the basket. In this example, rather than directly remembering the story, you remember what you can easily, that the story comes from a time before energy drinks, and then come up with the answer using logical inference. So, in the energy drink case, making the plausibility judgment might be easier than actually remembering one specific line in the story. In a similar vein, Lynn Rader of Carnegie Mellon University found that when confronted with questions that could be answered by directly remembering a passage from the story, people would nevertheless occasionally forego retrieving the fact and instead just judge whether it sounded like a plausible part of the story. She found that the choice of strategy depended on how easily the relevant information could be retrieved. So, in our example, if someone did not learn the contents of the basket well, making it hard to remember, they would be more likely to make a plausibility judgment. Of course, making a plausibility judgment also risks error. Imagine that instead of an energy drink, I asked whether Red brought her grandmother a muffin and some cookies. Plausibility might lead you astray here and drive you to incorrectly say yes. Indeed, until I looked at the actual story, I would never have guessed a bottle of wine was among the treats. Thus, people don't always go with plausibility. If Rader's volunteers knew the probe detail well enough, they would use direct retrieval and be more likely to be correct. Thus, in each case, people naturally balanced the cost of difficult retrieval against the benefit of a lower likelihood of error. It follows from this discussion that our control system must have access to some information about how well we know something, or even how likely we are to remember or know something in the future. This is sometimes called meta-memory, as it refers to our knowledge of the state of our own knowledge, and it is used to influence our retrieval by providing our memory system cues and inputs that we derive from knowledge itself. By elaborating or thinking about a concept, that concept becomes a cue and shapes how we retrieve, analogous to a query in a Google search. We weigh the likelihood of success against the effort required to recover an item and the risk of taking another, easier approach. Thus, when we are remembering, the determining factor is not the reliability of storage, but rather the optimal balance between the benefits of success and costs of ensuring that success. Control and the products of retrieval. Control of retrieval is not the only way that we can manage the costs and benefits of memory. We also have a suite of operations we can perform once retrieval has happened in order to make the most of what has been recovered. We will collectively refer to these as post-retrieval control processes, and they are just as essential to successful information retrieval as controlled retrieval. To illustrate, let's return to our example of the Google search. Even with well-chosen search terms, you will need to do some additional work to get to the web page you want anytime you search, because no matter what the search, you will likely retrieve more than one website. Indeed, even in the early days of Google, it was so hard to submit a query with only one return that a nerdy pastime sprang up called Google whacking. The goal of Google whacking was simple: enter two keywords into Google without quotation marks that return exactly one website. People who sifted through the thousands of word pairs necessary to find a search that qualified could ascend to Internet Valhalla by having their name and search term posted on the Google whacking website. Quite an honor indeed. If Google whacking teaches us anything, and it surely has taught us so much, it is that relying on only your search terms to retrieve exactly the target memory you want is incredibly hard. In almost every case, more work is needed to choose the website you want to use from the returned list. Yes, sometimes the website you want is the first one listed, but often it's not. That's why no one uses that "I'm feeling lucky" button Google provides to take you past the browser window and directly to the top site on a search. In 2007, Google estimated that 1% of searches went through that button, and I'd wager that they were rounding up. This problem is not unique to Google. It is in the nature of any large, distributed memory system to routinely produce lots of irrelevant results along with relevant ones in response to a query. So some form of post-retrieval monitoring and selection is almost always required. Human memory is no exception to this rule. We will remember information of varying utility for our goals, and given the constructive nature of memory, also of varying quality. We need to filter and monitor what we retrieve with respect to our goals and our conception of the world. Failing to do so can lead to various memory problems, including confabulation, discussed in Chapter 2. Further, just as the physical limits of our browser window constrain how many site summaries we can see at once, we have a limited working memory capacity in which to hold the products of retrieval. As a consequence, we must limit what information from long-term memory is allowed into working memory. In general, then, we need control that occurs post-retrieval whenever we decide to act on remembered knowledge. That action might be to make a response, to engage in some more retrieval, or to hang on to that retrieved knowledge in working memory. In this sense, then, post-retrieval control can be conceptualized as closely related to the gating processes we have discussed to this point. However, rather than gating information into working memory from our perceptual systems, in this case, we are gating in information arriving from long-term memory. To illustrate, one of the simplest everyday examples of post-retrieval control concerns the control over so-called output grain, or the level of detail we select from memory. When you remember a prior event, your memory is going to provide lots and lots of data, both general and detailed. A skilled storyteller will pick out just those bits needed to understand the narrative and leave out the unnecessary detail. A less controlled telling will just provide the details as they come, no matter how big or small, all treated with equal weight. It is a situation to be ardently avoided at a dinner party. When we pick the right details, we have controlled output grain. Control over output grain is another effective way to manage costs and benefits of retrieval, though here, post-retrieval. Though you might convey more information in a highly detailed report, you also risk making errors. If I ask my kids about an argument they had a week ago, they will give me the gist of what happened. It was in the afternoon. They had trouble taking turns. If I want more detail, I will need to probe for it. What time exactly? What was said? Who did what to whom? As these questions get detailed, I will get increasing uncertainty in their remembrances, and of course, increasingly disparate accounts. This makes sense, as details are generally harder to remember than the gist of a prior event. So the gist is probably more accurate, even though the details may be more informative. People routinely balance this trade-off between accuracy and informativeness in their reports. To do so, they make use of several contextual signals. They are sensitive to the factors in a situation that favor accuracy. For example, are they telling a story casually to a friend, or providing testimony in court? They also have access to metacognitive signals about the strength and reliability of the evidence they are recovering from memory. Using these signals will determine how effective a person is in controlling their grain size, and so balancing informativeness with accuracy. Not surprisingly, output gain control is characteristically hard for patients with frontal lobe damage. Brickner's 1936 account of patient A provides several illustrative examples. As Brickner described it, a striking example of intellectual malfunction is A's particularization. Frequently, all details seem to be of equal importance, and in the narration of a story, for example, few are omitted. Consider this instance when A is asked by one of his doctors what he did that morning. I woke up about 5 o'clock this morning, 4:30 or 5, and I stayed awake until I got out of bed about 20 minutes of 8 or half past 7. Then I got out of bed, and I came to the washroom, took some Listerine and washed my mouth. After that, I let the hot water run and got a piece of soap and washed my hands. Then I walked into this room and saw my dad and mother reading their papers. I did not wish to disturb them, so I walked to my own room, Yasha Debasha. Then I walked into Mrs. Adams's, his wife, room, and she didn't want to be disturbed until 8 o'clock, but that didn't stop me. I walked into that room, and she was sort of asleep. She appeared to be. I don't know whether she was. She gave that impression. You know, girls fool around in so many ways you don't know. I made a little disturbance, but I made enough noise so that she woke up. Well, I didn't see her last night. She was probably playing bridge while I was playing poker. I'm pretty sure I didn't see her last night. Most of us would have responded simply that we woke up early, got dressed, and then, because we were bored or missed them, we roused our spouse before they were ready. However, these key points are lost amidst details about what brand of mouthwash he used. Anyone who has spent much time with small children will have seen that their stories have a similar charm. Again, this is not a memory problem per se. It is a control problem. It is a failure to identify and choose those details that have the highest utility in terms of the balance between informativeness and accuracy. Post-retrieval control is also a prime means by which we offset some of the major causes of forgetting. We often think of forgetting as a decay process. Information gets put into memory, and then, like segments going bad on an old hard drive or a picture fading in time, our memory just corrodes and deteriorates. However, this folk theory of forgetting is not quite right. Rather than being a passive, time-dependent decay process, much of forgetting can be explained by active interference from other memories that block and corrupt the target memory. For example, has it ever happened to you that you are trying to remember a particular song, but the wrong song comes to mind? This always happens to me when I try to remember the theme song for the old Superman movie series starring Christopher Reeve. When I was a small child, I was enamored by the 1980 classic Superman 2, and I remember loving the theme song. But whenever I try to remember that song as an adult, I think of the Star Wars theme instead. At that point, it's hopeless. I am simply unable to remember the Superman theme. The Superman theme is still in my head somewhere, however. I haven't lost it. If I go find it on Spotify, I recognize it instantly. The main motif springs to mind almost as soon as the first horn plays its note. But when I try to remember it on my own, another memory interferes. When this happens to us, the imposter confounds us. It blocks our memory until it goes away, or we can suppress it in some way. Sometimes this happens when enough time passes that the blocking memory diminishes in mind, and the memory we wanted comes to mind spontaneously. Unfortunately, this often occurs when we no longer need the memory or care about it. Thus, we can also try to use post-retrieval control mechanisms to select the correct memory over the interfering memory, akin to how we might support the color naming pathway over the word reading pathway. It follows that failures of post-retrieval control can lead to greater interference and more forgetting. Take, for example, the forgetfulness that comes with old age. There are many causes for memory problems in older adults. but changes in post-retrieval control over interference are one of them. For example, a former postdoctoral fellow in my lab, Ilke Özteken, investigated this phenomenon directly in a group of older adults. In Ilke's study, adults between 60 and 74 years old were compared with younger adults aged 18 to 26. Both groups were repeatedly given sets of 3 words to remember and then a test word. For each test, they were to decide whether the test word matched one of the 3 words they had just seen. They would do this cycle repeatedly, receive a set of 3 words, get tested, and then receive 3 more words to remember. Without telling our volunteers, Ilke manipulated some of the test words to induce competition. Specifically, she included FOIL words that were not in the current study set, but that had been in previous study sets. This arrangement drives a tendency in people of all ages to say they remember these FOIL words as members of the current study set, even though they are not. Presumably, these false memories are because of interference. When those words appear, they feel familiar because they had just been seen recently. This familiarity pulls at us to say we remember seeing them in the study set. However, to answer correctly, we must figure out that they were not really part of the current set. In other words, we monitor what our memory system produces for quality assurance. When people are given enough time for this post-retrieval monitoring, they will correctly reject these FOIL words. Older adults will incorrectly report memory for the FOIL words at a higher rate than younger adults, as they are more influenced by the effect of competition. But why? Through some clever manipulations of the timing of her memory tests, Ilke observed that older adults are slower to start engaging in post-retrieval control than the younger adults. As a result, that feeling of familiarity from memory has time to build up and become stronger in the older group. That strength translates into higher rates of false memory. Thus, memory problems in old age are not always about losing information from our memory stores, but rather they sometimes arise from the control processes needed to guide memory retrieval and resolve interference. In the case of Ilke's experiment, memory failures were specifically attributable to differences in post-retrieval monitoring. As we will discuss further in Chapter 9, cognitive control changes as we age, and so these changes are a contributor to the problem with memory we experience in aging. In our daily lives, we routinely shift around our post-retrieval evaluation of our memories based on our current situation. Take, for example, the case of running into someone who is familiar to us, but we can't recollect where we encountered that person previously. In these kinds of situations, memory is providing some evidence of prior knowledge, but it is not without uncertainty. We know we can experience a feeling of familiarity for something entirely new. Indeed, we can even experience déjà vu, which might be explained as a feeling of familiarity in a situation we know we cannot have experienced before. Post-retrieval control needs to help us evaluate that evidence from memory in order to act. Importantly, the decision of whether to act or not has consequences. Maybe that person just looks a lot like someone else I know. There are real social costs to waving enthusiastically at a complete stranger. However, if I have met this person previously and just walk by them without acknowledgement, the perceived snub might be just as costly. Thus, when confronted with some evidence from memory, I have to make a decision about how to act on it. My decision will be at some level of uncertainty depending on the strength of the evidence from memory, and it must be balanced against the various costs and benefits of the action I will take. It would stand to reason that if I have a very strong feeling that I know this person, then I should be more likely to take the chance of saying hello. Conversely, a very weak sense of familiarity might lead me to move on. In essence, I need to set a threshold for the evidence from memory. If the strength of familiarity exceeds that internal threshold, then I will treat this person as someone I know, and if it does not, I will treat them as a stranger. Further, it is important to set that threshold flexibly depending on circumstances. For example, I might have a very different threshold depending on whether I am at a scientific meeting where I am highly likely to run into people I already know, versus touring with my family at a remote site in India. Laboratory studies have shown that people adjust their memory thresholds depending on what they know about the likelihood of encountering old or new items during a memory test. If people know it is unlikely they will encounter items they have seen before, or they are instructed to avoid saying they recognize an item that was not actually presented, then they will adjust their thresholds to be more conservative. Conversely, increasing the frequency of words they have seen before will make people more liberal, saying they recognize more words at test, even for words they did not actually study. In these two cases, people's memories are the same. They had no knowledge during study of the conditions at the test. It is what people do with the evidence retrieved from memory that differs based on the context. They adjust their decision threshold to balance the likelihood of correctly identifying old items against the costs of an error. Post-retrieval control is how they do this. In sum, control can affect memory in two ways in the service of information retrieval. By leveraging existing knowledge and foregrounding certain information as a cue, we can use controlled retrieval to make recovery of more useful information likely. Regardless of what our memory produces, however, we also engage in control post-retrieval to ensure we act on those memories that are most useful given our goals. How, then, are these processes supported in the brain? That's the topic of our next section. Two brain systems for the cognitive control of memory. Controlled retrieval and post-retrieval control are not independent. Rather, these processes necessarily trade off. Consider once more the analogy to a search engine. The better the quality of search terms you use in your query, the less junk will be retrieved into your browser window, and so the less time you will spend sifting through it all to locate what you want. Conversely, if it is hard to generate a good query, then post-retrieval processes can pick up the slack by selecting relevant information and suppressing the irrelevant. However, this distinction between pre- and post-retrieval is not merely descriptive. Cognitive neuroscience research suggests that the brain divides labor along these lines, devoting separate systems to pre- and post-retrieval control. Neuropsychologists have long observed that control systems are important for memory function. We have already discussed examples of frontal patients' deficits in the control of memory, such as using organizational strategies or adjusting output gain. In broad terms, patients with general problems in cognitive control will also show problems in memory in cases where the retrieval problem is difficult or when they must use their memories to solve new problems. Although memory control problems could arise from breakdowns in any of the control systems we have discussed to this point, it has also long been an observation that patients with damage to the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex are particularly susceptible to memory control problems. This general observation has led to a long debate about the role this region plays in the control of memory. Early evidence suggested that patients with damage to left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex had problems with controlled retrieval specifically. For example, these patients would show severe deficits in production tasks that rely on long-term memory. One such test is the verb generation task. In this test, the patients are given a noun as a cue, such as the word ball, to which they must generate as many verbs as they can that relate to that noun, like kick, throw, juggle, or roll. Patients with damage to the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex typically perform worse at this kind of task, producing fewer correct responses than do controls. The conventional interpretation of this deficit was that these patients suffered from a problem with controlled retrieval. That is, they were unable to use their knowledge of the noun to direct retrieval to the relevant verbs. A foundational study by cognitive neuroscientist Sharon Thompson-Schill called this interpretation into question. In this study, Thompson-Schill chose one set of noun cues with many associated verbs, like ball, and another set of nouns with only a few associated verbs, like book. You might predict that patients with a memory retrieval problem would have trouble in the latter case, because they are searching for these rarer associate verbs. But the patients with damage to the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex had the opposite problem. They had a hard time producing responses when there were many associates. So rather than having an issue retrieving, their problem was picking out the verbs to report from many competing alternatives. That is better described as a post-retrieval control process. The study from Thompson-Schill touched off a minor, though lively, debate in the cognitive neuroscience literature about how best to characterize the role of the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex in cognitive control of memory. Was it supporting controlled retrieval or post-retrieval control, or maybe both? I, too, joined this debate as a young scientist and devoted my doctoral research to this topic, which I developed into a theory of prefrontal contributions to control of memory. However, it was not until the field moved beyond the idea of individual brain regions that have specific localized functions and toward brain networks that compute through their connections that a clearer picture began to emerge. Years after this debate had largely died down, my doctoral student Jennifer Barreto and I returned to the memory control problem, but this time considering the networks that are important for these different modes of control. Jennifer came up with a memory task that allowed her to manipulate both controlled retrieval and post-retrieval control in the same experiment. This way, she could compare the two directly. Further, rather than focusing just on the left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, she studied the broader brain networks related to controlled retrieval and post-retrieval control. Using this approach, Jennifer discovered that the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is engaged by both forms of control, consistent with the prior reports. However, the broader networks engaged by these demands are entirely different. Controlled retrieval engages a ventral frontotemporal network that connects the frontal lobe with areas of the temporal lobe important for memory, like the hippocampus. In contrast, post-retrieval processing engages a dorsal network that closely matches the frontoparietal control system discussed to this point. In summary, then, the brain has at least two systems for controlling memory. Post-retrieval control is supported by the general frontoparietal control system. In fact, it is reasonable to hypothesize that it relies on working memory gating mechanisms to carry out its function. Specifically, as information is recovered from memory, those memories can be updated to working memory. Once there, they can influence responses through the input and output gating system in accord with their value. Controlling retrieval relies on a distinct network from the frontoparietal system, though we do not yet have much data on how its mechanisms work. One reasonable hypothesis is that it also relies on a working memory process similar to the one we have posited for other kinds of control. In this case, however, it is the cues and knowledge we use to query long-term memory that are held in working memory, rather than a task demand. Holding this information in memory thereby shapes what patterns of activity form in other parts of the brain that store our knowledge. Importantly, however, we should not interpret this network difference as indicating that these control functions are entirely independent of each other. As we have already noted, these two memory processes are in a push-pull relationship. If you set up a good retrieval plan, or elaborate useful cues, then it is likely that useful information will come to mind. However, if the controlled retrieval system does not operate effectively, such as by yielding more irrelevant information, this will put pressure on post-retrieval control. In other words, equilibrium is maintained between memory control processes. It is a homeostatic relationship. One may rely more on one process in one situation, or more on the other process in another, but ultimately, memory performance remains stable. There are profound implications for having two memory control systems that interact in this way. As just one example, consider the case of memory deficits in degenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease. According to the Alzheimer's Association, an estimated 5.8 million Americans had Alzheimer's disease in 2019, and that number is growing steadily with a growing older adult population. The disease results in slow degeneration in the brain, accompanied by progressive memory loss and dementia. Patients eventually lose memories of their families and closest loved ones, as well as awareness of where they are and what is happening about them. They become disoriented and confused and can no longer live independently. Ultimately, the disease is fatal. It is a tragic process that brings hardships and heartache to both those affected by the disease and their loved ones. A major worldwide effort is underway to better understand the disease and ultimately to better treat and cure it. There is evidence that the uncinate fasciculus and ventral stem white matter connecting the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobes are among white matter pathways to degrade early in Alzheimer's disease and are predictive of conversion to the disease. These are the very white matter pathways Jennifer identified in association with controlled retrieval. Why don't people start exhibiting memory problems earlier on in the disease if these pathways are degenerating? Nobody knows for sure, but one possible answer could be the homeostatic relationship between the memory control systems. If the ventral controlled retrieval system is less effective, the post-retrieval control system will start to pick up the slack to some degree. Over time, the controlled retrieval system might continue to degrade, and so more and more pressure will be placed on the post-retrieval system, which itself might start to suffer the effects of degeneration. At some point, a tipping point will be reached. The post-retrieval system can no longer compensate, and the full depths of the memory loss will be exposed as a catastrophic loss of memory function. Importantly, this is only an illustration of how changes to the homeostatic relationship of brain systems could be expressed in a degenerative disease. I am not proposing this as a theory of Alzheimer's disease, and there is no evidence for these specific dynamic changes in that disease. Rather, I offer this scenario to make concrete the implications of homeostatic memory control systems for aging and disease. Specifically, these dynamics can complicate diagnosis and yield a catastrophic change in cognitive function without a corresponding catastrophic event in the brain, like a stroke or closed head injury. The brain is a homeostatic organ with many systems complementing one another. Cognitive control function is a clear example of this, as we have seen in this audiobook. Thus, understanding its function requires understanding how its various subcomponents work together and trade off. Likewise, understanding changes in control function in any major disorder cannot focus on one system or one function. It will likely require understanding how this balance changes with progress of the disease. And that is the frontier of current systems neuroscience research on Alzheimer's disease. Value and memory. A critical topic that we have left out of our discussion of memory control so far is value, though this is central to our framing of memory control in terms of the information retrieval problem. As we've already noted, many external information retrieval systems rely on use as a proxy for value. However, imagine if they could track value more directly. Imagine if your librarian knew how much you loved a book that you checked out, or how much that article helped you write that research paper. Or consider if Google followed up on your web query to ask how helpful that website turned out to be. Indeed, what if Google just automatically knew how helpful its searches were? If these systems had this kind of information, then search devices designed to solve information retrieval could learn from their prior retrieval attempts and rank information based on their utility more directly. They would likely become even more effective at providing just what you need when you need it. Unlike Google or your librarian, your brain's search engine does have access to this information. When you achieve some measure of success at a task, your brain can assign credit accordingly. It can leverage more than just use. It has access to the goals and outcomes of your actions. This is just one more reason that your internal memory system far surpasses any artificial memory system. In Chapter 7, we discussed how reward prediction errors can lead to increases or decreases in the neurotransmitter dopamine. We also saw how this value information might modulate and serve as a learning signal for cognitive control systems, such as those that gate working memory. In recent years, it has also been observed that dopamine has targets within the brain systems responsible for retrieval from long-term memory, including the hippocampus itself. This signaling means that the retrieval system gets feedback about value, about how things are going, and how things went. It can use that information to modulate memory itself. Erin Brown, Elliot Wimmer, and Daphna Shahami provided evidence of this phenomenon in a maze learning task. Participants in the study would navigate around a maze on a computer screen to find a hidden reward. While wandering around the maze, they also encountered various pictures of objects along the way. The objects were incidental and unrelated to the task at hand. Nonetheless, on a memory test 24 hours later, the volunteers had a better memory for the objects that had been closer to the goal than those farther away. What happened here? People did not know where in the maze reward would occur, and so when they encountered an object in the maze, they did not know whether it was close to the goal. They knew its proximity only once they actually got to the goal. Thus, in the 24 hours following the maze run, the memory system must have re-evaluated the moments leading up to the goal and assigned the objects a memory strength based on their value. This made them easier to remember. What might be signaling the memory system about these rewarding outcomes? The authors of this study speculated that dopamine might be an important neurotransmitter in this kind of memory modulation. As discussed in Chapter 7, dopamine increases with prediction of an upcoming reward. Further, research with animal models has shown that dopamine increases may modulate the hippocampus to form new memories. Thus, dopamine might be a way that the brain can prioritize learning as a function of value. The brain doesn't need to know why things are good right now or if the content of thought is particularly good itself. But when reward signaling increases, the brain will prioritize memory for whatever the content of thought might be at that time, or what moments led up to that rewarding state of affairs. This makes that information more likely to be remembered in future. Harvard clinical psychologists Daniel Dillon and Diego Pizzagalli have proposed that disruptions of this internal prioritization system might be one explanation for memory disturbances experienced by people with clinical depression. Depressed people have been observed to show a negative bias in their memories. This means they are less likely than healthy people to remember positive events in their lives, while being more likely to remember the negative ones. Dillon and Pizzagalli noted that stressful events commonly trigger episodes of depression. Stress also has several effects on the brain that can cause memory problems, one of which is a blunting of dopamine release by the midbrain. If dopamine is less available to modulate hippocampal learning during depressed episodes, it will cause a general loss of that positivity bonus that healthy people enjoy. Thus, putting it all together, when a patient has a depressed episode, there will be less dopamine from the midbrain in response to positive events. Consequently, there will be less dopamine to modulate the hippocampus to remember these events. As a result, depressed patients will lose memory of positive events at a higher rate than a healthy person. It is not hard to imagine the problems that will follow from tending to forget the positive events in our life more than the negative ones. Indeed, it is characteristic of depressed persons that they will feel sad or even hopeless, even when their situation seems to be more positive than they feel or perceive. Given that memory is central to the model of the world we construct for ourselves, a negativity bias in memory could be a contributor to this characteristic construction of our world. In other words, being able to appropriately value memory doesn't just ensure that we remember useful things, it shapes our understanding of the world around us. When I was a child and was frustrated because I'd forgotten something I was going to tell my mother, she used to give me a comforting smile and tell me that only means it probably wasn't important. Back then, that served only to frustrate me all the more. But years later, as a scientist who studies cognitive control, I must acknowledge the wisdom in that adage. As we have discussed in this chapter, our memories did not evolve as storage devices like computer hard drives, but as search engines like Google. When confronted with a task or goal, we can bring to mind information with high utility for our situation. Multiple interacting control systems can help by actively generating retrieval plans, reducing interference after we remember. We assign value to memories based on the outcomes of our actions and prioritize them accordingly. We then use the recovered knowledge to construct models of the world, future scenarios, and possibilities of what could be. If we view memory in terms of information retrieval, it also makes clear how we might improve our memories. If we want to learn something, we must use it, because use is what our memory system cares about. I likewise advise my students to be active about their learning. Don't just passively read over the notes from lecture. It will seem like you understand what's there, but it's only an illusion of clarity. Rather, try to explain the concepts to someone else. Generate questions about the material to quiz your own knowledge, or indeed generate arguments or problems, or come to new ways of integrating and thinking about the material. By using control to assign ourselves these tasks and shape the use of memory, the brain has an opportunity not just to lay down a memory, but to discover the connection of that information to other knowledge we have and to the tasks we are doing. In essence, we don't use our memories to perform tasks. Rather, our tasks are what we use to remember.